Welcome to Spotlight Murders, where we dissect the most consequential legal cases in American history. I'm your host, Kieran Caldwell, and today we're diving deep into what many call the most important criminal trial of the 20th century, a case where overwhelming physical evidence met masterful legal manipulation, where prosecutorial incompetence collided with defense brilliance, and where America watched in real time as the justice system both succeeded and failed spectacularly. This is the story of the people of California versus Orenthal James Simpson, a trial that had everything: a beloved celebrity defendant, brutal double murder, a cast of colorful characters, and enough evidence to convict 10 men. Yet somehow, incredibly, it ended in acquittal. But this isn't just a story about one man's guilt or innocence. It's a masterclass in how cases are won and lost, not just on evidence, but on strategy, competence, and the ability to control narrative. It's about how a prosecution team with an airtight case managed to snatch defeat from the jaws of victory, while a defense team transformed their client's greatest vulnerabilities into their strongest assets. Over the next hour, we'll examine every crucial moment, every strategic decision, and every piece of evidence that made this trial a perfect storm of legal drama. We'll see how blood evidence became confusing, how scientific certainty was twisted into doubt, and how a single glove demonstration changed the course of American legal history. From the blood trail that led directly to Simpson's door, to the DNA evidence that should have sealed his fate, to the prosecution blunders that handed victory to the defense. This is the complete story of how the most documented murder case in history became the most shocking acquittal. Buckle up. We're going back to 1995, when America stopped everything to watch justice unfold on live television. If you are fascinated by the complexities of high-profile trials and the forces that shape justice, Scoob offers a deep dive into some of history's most captivating celebrity murders and trials from Tupac Shakur's murder to John Lennon's assassination, and more. Available now on the App Store and Google Play, Scoob features podcasts that unravel courtroom drama, investigative challenges, and landmark verdicts. Download Scoob today and explore the stories behind the headlines. Getting back to the O.J. Simpson case, let's examine the mountain of physical evidence that should have made this trial a clear-cut victory for the prosecution. Let's start with something that should have made this trial a slam dunk for the prosecution: the sheer volume of physical evidence connecting O.J. Simpson to the murders of Nicole Brown Simpson and Ronald Goldman. When you examine the evidence piece by piece, it paints such a clear picture that it's almost impossible to believe the case ended in acquittal. Picture this. O.J. Simpson was a regular shopper at Bloomingdale's, where he purchased size 12 dress and casual shoes. Now here's where it gets interesting. A glove matching the exact type that Nicole had given Simpson from that same store in December 1990 was found at the murder scene. This wasn't just any glove. This specific style was highly exclusive, with only 200 pairs available nationwide that year. And here's the kicker. Visual evidence from NFL games broadcast between January 1991 and 1994 showed Simpson wearing these exact distinctive gloves. The gloves discovered at both the Bundy crime scene and Simpson's Rockingham estate were labeled extra large, a size that corresponded perfectly with Simpson's hands. Think about the odds of that coincidence. We're talking about a rare, expensive glove that Simpson had been photographed wearing, found at both the murder scene and his residence. But that was just the beginning. Dark blue cotton fibers resembling those from a sweatsuit Simpson wore on the night of the murders were discovered on Ron Goldman's shirt. Hair samples exhibiting microscopic characteristics similar to Simpson's were found in a dark knit cap located near Goldman's feet. Another hair with similar characteristics was discovered on Goldman's shirt itself. The evidence gets even more damning. A fiber comparable in microscopic features and rose beige color to the carpet of Simpson's Ford Bronco was identified on the knit cap found at the murder scene. Blood traces linked to both Nicole and Ron were detected inside Simpson's Bronco. Nicole's blood was found on socks in Simpson's bedroom, along with traces of Simpson's own blood on those same socks. Here's what makes this evidence so compelling. It wasn't just one or two connections. This was a web of physical evidence that tied Simpson to the crime from multiple angles: fibers, hair, blood, gloves, shoes. Each piece alone might be explained away, but together they created what should have been an unbreakable chain of proof. And then there was the timing. The homicides occurred on the very day Nicole had denied Simpson's request to accompany her to their daughter's dance recital, and he was unable to reach his girlfriend, Paula Barbieri, potentially suggesting multiple personal rejections that could have triggered his rage. This wasn't random violence. This was personal. The prosecution also had documented evidence of Simpson's history of domestic violence against Nicole. There were well-documented instances of Simpson severely assaulting Nicole in the past, making her fearful enough to confide in others that she believed he intended to kill her. This wasn't just about a jealous ex-husband. This was about a documented pattern of escalating violence. Perhaps most telling was a witness account from Robert Heidstra, who reported hearing a heated conversation between two men at the crime scene and observed a white utility vehicle that he believed could be a Ford Bronco departing swiftly from the area. Even this defense witness was inadvertently providing evidence that supported the prosecution's case. When you step back and look at the totality of evidence, it painted a picture so clear that experienced prosecutors thought this would be among the easiest murder cases they'd ever handle. Simpson had means, motive, and opportunity. His blood was at the scene. The victim's blood was in his car and home. Fibers from his clothing were on the victim's, and rare gloves he'd been photographed wearing were found at both locations. This should have been a conviction that took the jury about 20 minutes to reach. Instead, it became the foundation for one of the most stunning legal reversals in American history. Because as we'll see, having overwhelming evidence and successfully presenting it to a jury are two very different things. The prosecution was about to learn that in criminal law, it's not just about what you can prove. It's about how well you can prove it, how clearly you can explain it, and how effectively you can counter the inevitable attempts to confuse and mislead the jury. And on all those fronts, they were about to fail spectacularly. If there was one aspect of the Simpson case that should have sealed the prosecution's victory, it was the blood evidence. Blood doesn't lie, DNA doesn't fabricate stories, and the scientific connections between Simpson and the crime scene were as clear as fingerprints. Yet somehow, the defense managed to transform the prosecution's greatest strength into a source of confusion and doubt. Let's start with what the evidence actually showed. LAPD criminalist Dennis Fung testified that approximately 30 bloodstains were collected from Simpson's white 1993 Ford Bronco. But here's what's crucial. Fung noted there were at least 20 additional lighter bloodstains inside the Bronco that weren't even collected. This wasn't a case of minimal blood evidence. There was blood throughout the vehicle. The majority of the blood found in the Bronco belonged to Simpson himself, while some belonged to the two victims. Beyond the Bronco, Simpson's blood was found in multiple locations. One drop on the street behind the Bronco at Rockingham, another within the Rockingham gate, 3 drops along the driveway leading to Simpson's front door, 5 blood drops in the foyer, and even a drop on the bathroom floor. This created what investigators call a blood trail, a path of evidence leading directly from the crime scene to Simpson's residence. In total, 45 blood samples were analyzed for DNA, creating what should have been an unbreakable scientific chain connecting Simpson to the murders. But here's where the defense showed their brilliance in manipulation. They consistently misrepresented the amount of blood evidence to the media and the public, claiming that less than 1 drop of blood was found in the Bronco. They attributed this claim to Gary Sims, a forensic chemist from the California Department of Justice, but Sims never made this assertion. What actually happened was this. During cross-examination, defense attorney Barry Scheck asked Sims if 5 specific bloodstains from the console combined accounted for no more than 100 nanograms of DNA, less than a single drop of blood. Sims replied that it might slightly exceed that, but it is around that ballpark. But this estimation referred only to blood found on the console, not throughout the entire vehicle. This is a perfect example of how the defense took a narrow, technical statement about one specific location and twisted it to suggest there was hardly any blood evidence in the entire car. It was masterful misdirection that the prosecution failed to adequately counter. The defense also promoted another misleading narrative, that if Simpson were the killer, he would have been covered in blood, and therefore there should have been significantly more blood evidence in the Bronco. Johnny Cochran argued this point repeatedly to the jury, suggesting the absence of massive blood evidence proved Simpson's innocence. But this argument was fundamentally flawed, and the prosecution should have demolished it easily. The blood evidence actually supported the prosecution's case when properly understood. For instance, the bloody shoe prints of the suspect had already faded by the time they reached the alley at Bundy, indicating that blood transfer was diminishing as the killer moved away from the immediate crime scene. More importantly, the nature of the victim's wounds didn't necessarily result in massive blood transfer to the attacker. When someone is stabbed, blood transfer to the attacker typically occurs only if the attacker is positioned in front of the victim, an artery is severed, and there's no clothing covering the affected area. In Nicole's case, while her carotid arteries were slit, Dr. Lack testified that the attacker likely attacked from behind, not from a position where massive blood spurting would cover the killer. In Ron Goldman's case, puncture wounds to his aorta occurred toward the end of the attack when minimal blood remained in his body, and the area was covered by clothing. The prosecution had expert testimony explaining exactly why the blood evidence matched what you'd expect from these particular murders, but they failed to present it clearly and forcefully enough to counter the defense's misleading arguments. Perhaps most problematically, some jurors and defense supporters suggested that Simpson's blood at the scene might have been from an earlier visit, not the night of the murders. This theory was completely undermined by Simpson's own statement to police the day after the murders, where he specifically said that during his last visit to Bundy about a week before the murders, he neither cut himself nor bled. Additionally, Dennis Fung testified that Simpson's blood drops at the scene appeared fresh, showing bright red coloration and transferring easily to cotton swabs. Some blood that wasn't collected immediately changed to dark brown later that same day, proving the freshness of the samples initially gathered. The most damning aspect of the blood evidence was its location. Simpson's blood was found adjacent to the murderer's bloody shoe prints, leading away from the bodies. What are the odds that Simpson would coincidentally bleed in the exact spots where the killer's footprints were found, unless Simpson was the killer? Yet somehow, through a combination of defense misdirection, prosecution inadequacy, and jury confusion about scientific evidence, what should have been the case's strongest evidence became a source of doubt rather than certainty. This transformation of scientific strength into courtroom weakness would become a recurring theme throughout the trial, and it offers crucial lessons about the difference between having evidence and effectively presenting it to a jury. Sometimes in criminal cases, it's not just the evidence that convicts a defendant, it's the defendant's own explanations for that evidence. And in the Simpson case, perhaps no single piece of evidence revealed consciousness of guilt more clearly than Simpson's mysterious finger injury and his completely implausible explanation for how it occurred. Let's be absolutely clear about what we're discussing here. This wasn't a minor scratch or a small cut. We're talking about a significant, deep wound on Simpson's left middle finger that was severe enough to leave blood throughout his car, home, and driveway. Photographic evidence documented this injury, and both Detective Lang and Detective Vanatter confirmed that the wound was noticeably bandaged the day after the murders. Despite the severity of this injury and the extensive blood trail it created, Simpson claimed he had no recollection of how he sustained this cut. Think about that for a moment. This wasn't a case of forgetting a paper cut. This was a wound significant enough that it bled profusely in multiple locations. Yet Simpson, a man known for his articulate communication skills, suddenly developed amnesia about how it happened. How often in your adult life have you injured yourself so severely that you bled profusely in your car and home, yet had no memory of the incident? The notion is not just unlikely, it's absurd. Such severe injuries are memorable precisely because they're painful, surprising, and require immediate attention. The idea that someone could sustain such a wound and completely forget how it happened suggests a consciousness of guilt so profound that the defendant doesn't dare offer an explanation. But the implausibility goes even deeper when you consider the timing. We're asked to believe that Simpson innocently sustained a substantial injury to his left middle finger at nearly the identical time that his ex-wife Nicole and Ron Goldman were murdered. What are the statistical odds of such a coincidence? Think about your own adult life. Significant injuries requiring medical attention are relatively rare events. Most adults might sustain such an injury a few times per decade, if that. Yet we're supposed to believe that Simpson just happened to severely cut his finger during the precise time frame when these brutal murders occurred. The timing isn't just suspicious, it's virtually impossible as a coincidence. When you factor in that the killer likely injured his left hand during the struggle, evidenced by the left glove being found at the scene and 4 out of 5 blood droplets being positioned to the left of the bloody shoe impressions, the coincidence becomes mathematically absurd. The defense's implicit argument was that around the exact moment his ex-wife was being murdered, Simpson coincidentally suffered a severe cut to his left hand and conveniently forgot how it happened. Any reasonable person would find such a narrative beyond credible belief. But the story gets even more ridiculous when you examine the blood trail pattern. Even if we were to accept, absurdly, that the timing of Simpson's injury coinciding with the murders was mere coincidence, we still have to explain the pattern of blood he left throughout his property. Have you ever cut your finger and subsequently left blood drops throughout your car and house? It's an almost comical scenario when spoken aloud. When people suffer cuts, their instinctive response is to immediately apply pressure to stop the bleeding using their hand, a handkerchief, or a bandage. The idea of walking around dripping blood everywhere suggests someone in a panicked, frenzied state, exactly the mental condition you'd expect from someone who had just committed murder. Normal people don't wander around their homes and cars, leaving blood trails after suffering cuts. They seek immediate medical attention, or at least basic first aid. The pattern of blood found at Simpson's property was consistent with someone who was too distracted or emotionally disturbed to address a bleeding wound properly, the behavior of someone whose mind was occupied with far more serious concerns than a cut finger. The prosecution made this point effectively, noting that Simpson's blood distribution pattern reflected panic and distraction, not the normal response someone would have to a simple accident. This wasn't the behavior of someone who accidentally cut themselves while unpacking luggage or handling household items. This was the behavior of someone whose mind was focused on much more serious matters than a bleeding finger. Later, Simpson would offer various explanations for his injury, including suggestions that he cut himself on broken glass in a Chicago hotel room. But these after-the-fact explanations only made his situation worse, because they contradicted his original claim of complete amnesia about the injury. If you genuinely don't remember how you were injured, you can't later provide specific details about when and where it happened. The inconsistency between claiming amnesia and then offering detailed explanations revealed the fabricated nature of his story. In legal terms, the prosecution's responsibility was to establish guilt beyond a reasonable doubt, not beyond all conceivable doubt. But in Simpson's case, the evidence of guilt transcended even that high standard. The combination of the severe injury, the impossible timing, the forgotten explanation, and the panicked blood trail pattern created proof of guilt that was beyond reasonable argument. Yet somehow, this consciousness of guilt indicator which should have been devastatingly effective with the jury, failed to achieve its intended impact. The prosecution's inability to drive home the implications of Simpson's implausible injury story represents one of their most significant failures in presenting what should have been a compelling case for consciousness of guilt. Perhaps nowhere in the Simpson trial was the gap between scientific reality and courtroom perception more stark than in the handling of DNA evidence. The defense managed to accomplish something that should have been impossible. They convinced a jury that some of the most reliable scientific evidence in criminal law was actually grounds for reasonable doubt. The foundation of this deception was the defense's contamination argument, the claim that contamination of blood samples could account for DNA results identifying the blood as Simpson's. This argument was not just scientifically flawed, it was scientifically backwards. Yet it became central to the defense strategy and, tragically, central to the jury's reasoning for acquittal. Here's what the science actually says about DNA contamination. Howard Coleman, president of Genelex, a prominent DNA laboratory in Seattle, explained that while every laboratory sample is subject to some degree of contamination, contamination does not produce false positive results. Instead, contamination causes results to become inconclusive, what scientists call garbage in, garbage out. Think about this logically. If you contaminate a blood sample, you don't get a cleaner, more definitive result. You get a muddied, unclear result that can't be reliably interpreted. Contamination doesn't magically transform one person's DNA into another person's DNA. It destroys the clarity needed for positive identification. This means the defense's contamination argument was scientifically nonsensical. If the samples had been contaminated, as they claimed, the result would have been no conclusive match at all. The fact that investigators got definitive matches to Simpson's DNA actually proved that contamination hadn't occurred, not the reverse. The prosecution should have been arguing that contamination would have prevented clear results, not the defense. In cases where contamination truly obstructs analysis, there would be no conclusive identification possible. But in Simpson's case, the evidence showed clear, definitive matches, proving that the samples were clean and the results reliable. Yet the defense managed to flip this scientific reality completely upside down. They convinced the jury that definitive DNA matches were somehow evidence of contamination rather than evidence of reliability. It was a masterpiece of misdirection that exploited the jury's lack of scientific understanding. The prosecution's handling of this issue was catastrophically inadequate. The DNA evidence presentation was unnecessarily complex, filled with unfamiliar genetic terminology and molecular statistics that confused rather than clarified. Consider how a 72-year-old juror with minimal education might have struggled to understand the layers of genetic evidence being presented in technical language. The defense capitalized on this confusion by subjecting LAPD criminalists like Dennis Fung and Andrea Mazzola to prolonged cross-examinations by skilled DNA lawyers from New York. These sessions emphasized alleged evidence contamination and procedural errors, creating a narrative that all DNA results should be dismissed due to sloppy police work. Under this mounting pressure, the prosecution finally introduced Dr. Robin Cotton, laboratory director at Cellmark and a DNA expert, to clarify that alleged evidence mishandling would not produce false DNA positives. But the timing was disastrous. The contamination fallacy had already taken root in the jurors' minds, making Dr. Cotton's explanation seem like damage control rather than scientific education. This strategic error became evident in post-trial interviews, where jurors like Lionel Cryer and David Aldana echoed the defense's garbage in, garbage out theme. In her book, Madam Foreman, juror Marcia Rubin Jackson described extensive jury discussions about perceived careless evidence, handling, and potential contamination. The prosecution's fundamental mistake was reactive rather than proactive strategy. They knew from the defense's opening statement that contamination would be a central argument, Yet they allowed hours of testimony about alleged police incompetence before educating the jury about DNA basics. They should have brought Dr. Cotton in early to establish the scientific foundation before the defense could muddy the waters. This failure was particularly tragic because DNA evidence in the Simpson case was among the strongest ever presented in a criminal trial. The statistical probabilities were overwhelming. We're talking about odds of millions or billions to one that the blood matches were coincidental. Yet the defense managed to transform this certainty into doubt through scientific misdirection. The contamination deception worked because it tapped into common sense understanding of the garbage in, garbage out principle, while completely inverting its application to DNA analysis. People understand that contamination usually makes things less reliable, so the defense argument seemed logical even though it was scientifically backwards. This represents one of the most successful instances of jury manipulation in American legal history. The defense took the prosecution's strongest evidence and convinced 12 people that strength was actually weakness, that clarity was actually confusion, and that scientific certainty was actually grounds for doubt. The implications extend far beyond the Simpson case. This trial demonstrated how scientific evidence, no matter how reliable, can be undermined by skilled attorneys who understand that perception often matters more than reality in the courtroom. It's a sobering lesson about the gap between scientific truth and legal truth, and about the critical importance of effective science communication in our justice system. The prosecution had evidence that should have convicted Simpson beyond any reasonable doubt. Instead, they allowed that evidence to become a source of confusion and suspicion. In the end, it wasn't science that failed in the Simpson trial. It was the presentation of science. The Simpson trial offers perhaps the most comprehensive case study in prosecutorial incompetence in modern American legal history. This wasn't a case where the prosecution lacked evidence or faced insurmountable challenges. This was a case where overwhelming evidence was undermined by strategic blunders, factual errors, and a fundamental misunderstanding of how to present complex information to a jury. Let's start with the basic requirement that prosecutors know the facts of their own case. The errors made by lead prosecutor Marcia Clark were not minor oversights. They were fundamental misstatements about crucial evidence that the defense was able to exploit repeatedly. During closing arguments, Clark incorrectly told the jury that both of Nicole's jugular veins had been severed. In reality, the coroner had testified that only the left jugular vein was almost completely severed, while the right was merely nicked. This wasn't a subtle distinction. It was a significant factual error about the nature of the victim's injuries. Clark also misrepresented testimony about the limousine driver, Alan Park. She argued that Park saw Simpson's Ford Bronco parked near the Rockingham gate when he left with Simpson after 11 p.m., but Park's actual testimony was far less definitive. He stated he didn't focus on whether the Bronco was there and couldn't confirm its presence. This kind of overstatement damages prosecutorial credibility when defense attorneys can point to the actual testimony. Perhaps most damaging was Clark's handling of Simpson's explanation for his finger injury. Dr. Michael Baden had testified that Simpson recalled seeing blood after retrieving items from his Bronco. Instead of using Simpson's own statement to police where he admitted not knowing how he cut himself, Clark sarcastically suggested to the jury that Simpson fabricated a story about cutting himself on a razor-sharp cell phone. This sarcastic approach was problematic for multiple reasons. First, it mischaracterized Baden's testimony. Second, it made Clark appear condescending toward the jury. Third, it missed the opportunity to use Simpson's actual statement admitting he didn't know how the injury occurred, which would have been far more damaging than mockery. The prosecution also made basic factual errors that undermined their credibility. Clark told the jury that Ron Goldman was 5 feet 5 inches tall, when the coroner's report clearly stated he was 5 feet 9 inches. She claimed that all 14 officers who arrived at the crime scene before Detective Furman noticed only one glove, when only 2 officers had actually testified to this effect. These errors weren't just embarrassing, they were strategic disasters. Every time the defense could point to a prosecutorial mistake, it reinforced their narrative that the entire case was built on sloppy work and unreliable information. But the prosecution's problems went far deeper than factual errors. Their strategic decisions were often baffling, none more so than their handling of the coroner's testimony. Dr. Lack should have been on the stand for no more than 2 hours, covering the essential points: cause of death, number and significance of wounds, probable time of death, description of the murder weapon, and whether Dr. Golden's errors affected key findings. Instead, prosecutor Brian Kellberg subjected Dr. Lack to 8 days of direct examination, likely a record that delved into exhaustive detail on every conceivable point. This marathon included a dramatic reenactment of the murders, with Dr. Lack playing the role of the killer. It was completely unnecessary and counterproductive. The extended examination could only suggest to the jury that there were serious problems with the autopsy when there weren't, and that the prosecution was deeply worried about those problems. If they weren't concerned, why allocate so much time to addressing them? When your job is to prove guilt beyond reasonable doubt, creating doubt in the jury's mind is self-sabotage. Kellberg compounded this error by pressuring Dr. Lack to specify exactly how the murders occurred, down to the sequence of stab wounds. But how could the doctor possibly know this level of detail? The prosecution was creating an obligation they couldn't meet, proving not just Simpson's guilt, but exactly how the crimes were committed. This approach led to pure speculation and conjecture. Kellberg even suggested scenarios where the murderer struck Nicole unconscious before attacking Goldman, then returned to kill Nicole. When Dr. Lack couldn't offer plausible explanations, Kellberg helped him hypothesize. The result was testimony filled with words like possibility and might have occurred, exactly the kind of uncertainty that creates reasonable doubt. Predictably, when the defense called their forensic expert, Dr. Michael Baden, he ridiculed the prosecution's scenarios as absurd. Baden, being paid over $100,000 for his services, contradicted Dr. Lack on multiple points, creating a battle of experts that benefited only the defense. Perhaps most inexcusably, Kellberg failed to ask the most important question: whether Dr. Lack could determine to a reasonable medical certainty if the murders involved one or multiple perpetrators. The defense's central argument was that multiple killers were involved, which would have undermined the prosecution's case even if it didn't legally absolve Simpson. During cross-examination, defense attorney Robert Shapiro immediately asked this crucial question: "Doctor, can you tell us with a reasonable degree of medical certainty how many killers were involved in this case?" Dr. Lack replied, "No." This response generated headlines like, "Potential multiple killers can't be ruled out," exactly what the prosecution should have addressed proactively during direct examination. The prosecution also failed to call key witnesses who could have strengthened their case. Robert Heedstra, a defense witness who heard the dog barking at 10:35 p.m., created timeline problems for the prosecution. But instead of calling him first and addressing his testimony directly, they allowed the defense to use him effectively against their timeline. These errors weren't just tactical mistakes. They revealed a fundamental misunderstanding of trial strategy. Criminal trials aren't academic exercises where you explore every possible angle. They're persuasion contests where clarity, focus, and credibility determine outcomes. The prosecution had more than enough evidence to convict Simpson. What they lacked was the competence to present that evidence effectively. In trying to address every possible defense argument, they created confusion where there should have been clarity. In attempting to prove everything, they ended up proving nothing convincingly. This case stands as a monument to the principle that having evidence isn't enough. You must know how to use it. The Simpson prosecution had the tools for victory, but lacked the skill to wield them effectively. Before we unravel the moment that changed everything in the Simpson trial, If you're hungry for more deep dives into celebrity murders, check out Scoob. Available now on the App Store and Google Play, Scoob offers expertly researched podcasts that peel back the layers on cases like the Tate LaBianca murders, Maurizio Gucci's murder, and many more. Download Scoob today. Now let's get back to the O.J. trial and the one piece of evidence that turned the whole case upside down. If there was a single moment that encapsulated everything wrong with the prosecution's handling of the Simpson case, it was the glove demonstration. This wasn't just a tactical error. It was a catastrophic gamble that transformed one of the prosecution's strongest pieces of evidence into their most devastating defeat. The gloves themselves were damning evidence. These were rare, expensive gloves that Nicole had purchased for Simpson from Bloomingdale's in December 1990. Only 200 pairs of this style were available nationwide that year, making them nearly unique. Simpson had been photographed wearing these exact gloves during NFL broadcasts between 1991 and 1994. One glove was found at the murder scene, the other at Simpson's residence. Both were extra large, matching Simpson's hand size. This should have been slam dunk evidence. The prosecution had photographic proof that Simpson owned and wore these gloves. They had witnesses who could testify about the purchase, and they had the gloves themselves connecting the crime scene to Simpson's property. It was the kind of physical evidence that juries find compelling and easy to understand. But then came June 15th, 1995, a date that will live in prosecutorial infamy. During the trial, prosecutor Christopher Darden made the inexplicable decision to have Simpson try on the bloody gloves in front of the jury. As Simpson struggled with the gloves, he proclaimed loudly enough for everyone to hear, "Too tight," or "they don't fit," appearing to have difficulty pulling them over his hands. The moment was captured live on television and broadcast around the world. Johnny Cochran would later immortalize it with his famous phrase, "If it doesn't fit, you must acquit." What should have been evidence of guilt became the foundation for reasonable doubt. Juror Carrie Bess expressed the devastating impact of this demonstration in her book, Madam Foreman. She questioned why the prosecution didn't test the gloves on someone with similar hand size before allowing such a high-stakes demonstration. She felt disheartened seeing the gloves appear ill-fitting when she had expected them to be a perfect match. The prosecution's decision to proceed with this demonstration was remarkably unwise for multiple reasons that should have been obvious to any competent attorney. They were gambling the entire case on a demonstration they hadn't properly tested, with gloves that had been compromised by evidence collection procedures. In a sidebar conference just before the demonstration, Marcia Clark acknowledged concerns that latex gloves, which Simpson had to wear to avoid contaminating evidence, could affect the fit. Additionally, the gloves had been soaked in blood and subsequently dried, causing shrinkage. Any gloves that had been wet and then dried would be smaller than their original size. Simpson had worn these gloves regularly during football games in rain and snow conditions. Anyone who has worn leather gloves in wet conditions knows they shrink when they dry. The prosecution was essentially asking Simpson to put on gloves that had been intentionally made smaller through the evidence collection and preservation process. During the sidebar discussion, Darden actually requested permission to use new gloves of the same type, rather than the evidence gloves themselves. Judge Ito dismissed Johnny Cochran's objection and suggested using the actual evidence gloves. Court reporter Janet Moxham recounted that Darden was initially reluctant to proceed with the evidence gloves, but after Marcia Clark whispered something to him, he unexpectedly requested the demonstration. This suggests that the disastrous decision may have been Clark's idea, whispered to Darden at the crucial moment. If so, it represents one of the most consequential whispered conversations in legal history. The demonstration was problematic on multiple levels beyond just the fit issues. Simpson was wearing latex gloves underneath the evidence gloves, adding bulk that would make any glove feel tighter. He was also motivated to make the gloves appear not to fit, and there are subtle ways to make gloves seem too small. not fully extending fingers, keeping hands tense, or not pulling the gloves completely down. More fundamentally, the prosecution was allowing the defendant to essentially perform for the jury. They gave Simpson, a man who had spent years in front of cameras, a chance to act his way toward acquittal. It was theater, not evidence, and theater was exactly what the defense needed. According to Newsweek, the glove demonstration was seen as either an incredible acting feat by a man not known for his acting prowess, or a monumental misstep by the district attorney's office, or possibly both. The publication captured the surreal nature of the moment, a murder trial being decided by what amounted to a costume fitting. The prosecution should have known better. Even a first-year law student would likely avoid such a risky demonstration without absolute certainty of the outcome. There was no pressure from the defense to conduct this demonstration, no urgent need for it, and no strategic advantage that couldn't be gained through other means. They could have simply presented the photographic evidence of Simpson wearing the gloves, testimony about their rarity and his ownership of them, and expert testimony about leather shrinkage after blood exposure. This would have been far more reliable and less dramatic than live courtroom theater. Instead, they handed the defense their most powerful moment. The image of Simpson struggling with the gloves became the defining visual of the entire trial. It overshadowed mountains of scientific evidence, DNA analysis, and expert testimony. In the battle between complex forensic evidence and simple visual demonstration, the demonstration won decisively. The glove incident encapsulated everything wrong with the prosecution's approach: overconfidence, poor preparation, failure to anticipate problems, and a fundamental misunderstanding of how juries process information. They transformed their strongest evidence into their weakest moment, and in doing so, they may have changed the outcome of the most watched trial in American history. Johnny Cochran understood something the prosecution didn't. In the television age, powerful images matter more than complex evidence. The prosecution gave him the image he needed, and he used it to devastating effect. The gloves that should have convicted Simpson instead became the symbol of his innocence, at least in the minds of 12 jurors who had to render the only verdict that mattered. No figure in the Simpson trial was more controversial, more vilified, or more central to both sides' strategies than LAPD detective Mark Fuhrman. The defense made him the villain of their story, a racist cop who planted evidence to frame an innocent black man. But examining the full picture of Fuhrman's character reveals a more complex reality and highlights another massive prosecution failure. Fuhrman was crucial to the prosecution's case because he was the detective who found the glove at Simpson's Rockingham estate. He was also present at the crime scene and involved in the initial investigation. His credibility was essential to establishing the chain of custody and authenticity of key evidence. The defense understood this perfectly. If they could destroy Fuhrman's credibility, they could cast doubt on all the evidence he touched. Their strategy was brilliant in its simplicity. Paint Fuhrman as such a virulent racist that the jury would believe he was capable of planting evidence to frame Simpson. The infamous Fuhrman tapes provided the ammunition they needed. These recordings, made by screenwriter Laura Hart McKinney, captured Fuhrman using racial slurs and describing inappropriate police conduct during interviews for a screenplay project. The most damaging revelation was Fuhrman's repeated use of the word nigger, a word he had denied using during his testimony. When these tapes surfaced, they created a public relations disaster for the prosecution. Fuhrman went from being a key witness to being one of the most reviled figures in America. The defense had successfully transformed a detective into a symbol of police racism. But here's what makes the prosecution's handling of this crisis so inexplicable. They had abundant evidence to rehabilitate Fuhrman's character, yet they chose not to use it. After the tapes became public, numerous colleagues came forward to defend Fuhrman's character and dispute the image of him as a racist officer. Greg Krikorian's investigation for the Los Angeles Times on November 8, 1995, revealed a very different picture of Fuhrman. The last instance where Furman used racial slurs on the tapes was in 1988, 7 years before he testified at Simpson's trial. This suggested that whatever racist attitudes he may have held were not recent or active during the investigation. More importantly, Krikorian interviewed Furman's colleagues and partners throughout his LAPD career, and their accounts contradicted the image of him as a racist officer. Sergeant Roberto Alanis, a Latino officer, stated that the Mark Furman he knew was not racist, and that Furman had actively sought him as a partner in 1984. Sergeant Ed Palmer, an African-American officer who worked with Furman at the West Los Angeles station in 1994, expressed disbelief about the taped comments. Palmer said that if Furman were truly racist, he would have confronted him about it, but he never observed any racial animosity from Furman in their personal interactions. Carlton Brown, a black homicide detective who partnered with Furman for most of 1993, admitted uncertainty about Furman's racial views, but said he had never observed racial animosity. Brown acknowledged he might be naive, but didn't think he was missing obvious racist behavior. Interviews with more than 6 additional LAPD officers, most of whom were black or Latino, painted a picture that contrasted sharply with the defense's portrayal of Furman as a rogue racist cop. While they described him as aggressive and sometimes arrogant, they suggested that if Furman harbored toxic racial views, he concealed them effectively from his diverse colleagues. These interviews indicated that people who were specifically positioned to observe racist behavior, minority officers who worked closely with Furman, had not detected the kind of virulent racism that would make evidence planting believable. This was exactly the kind of character evidence that could have rehabilitated Furman with the jury. The prosecution's failure to present this evidence was strategic malpractice. They maintained their position that Furman hadn't planted evidence or attempted to frame Simpson, but they made no effort to support this claim with character evidence from his colleagues. They essentially abandoned one of their key witnesses without a fight. This failure was particularly damaging because the defense's case relied heavily on the jury believing that Furman was not just racist, but racist enough to risk his career by planting evidence. The testimony from his minority colleagues would have directly contradicted this narrative. Instead, the prosecution allowed Furman to become a symbol of police racism without any counterbalance. They let the defense define him entirely through the tapes and inflammatory testimony, creating exactly the villain narrative that Johnny Cochran needed to explain away the physical evidence. The irony is that the prosecution's own expert witnesses and evidence collection procedures should have made evidence planting nearly impossible to accomplish without detection. The prosecution could have argued that regardless of Furman's personal views, the scientific evidence was independently verified and couldn't have been fabricated. But by abandoning Furman completely, they essentially conceded that if he was racist, then evidence planting was possible. This concession was devastating because it provided a non-racial explanation for the mountain of physical evidence connecting Simpson to the murders. The Furman controversy illustrates how character assassination can overwhelm even strong physical evidence when prosecutors fail to defend their key witnesses. The defense understood that destroying Furman's credibility was more important than directly challenging the evidence itself. They were right. By making Furman the central figure rather than the evidence, they shifted the trial's focus from "Did Simpson commit murder?" to "Is Mark Furman a racist?" Once that transformation occurred, the prosecution had already lost the most important battle of the trial. The lesson is clear. In high-profile cases, prosecutors must be prepared to defend not just their evidence, but the people who collected that evidence. Character assassination is a powerful defense tool, but it can be countered with character evidence if prosecutors have the wisdom and courage to use it. The Simpson trial wasn't just a legal proceeding. It was the first major criminal case to unfold entirely in the television age, with gavel-to-gavel coverage that transformed how America consumed and understood justice. But the media's role went far beyond mere documentation. Television coverage, particularly the commentary by legal talking heads, actively shaped perceptions of the case in ways that may have influenced the outcome. The most perverse aspect of the media coverage was how it consistently undermined confidence in what should have been seen as a strong prosecution case. Night after night, legal commentators expressed concerns about the prosecution's performance, suggested their case was faltering, and amplified every defense argument while minimizing prosecution successes. This created a bizarre disconnect between reality and perception. The prosecution had Simpson's blood at the crime scene, the victim's blood in his car and home, rare gloves he'd been photographed wearing found at both locations, fibers from his clothing on the victims, and a clear motive rooted in documented domestic violence. By any objective measure, this was an overwhelming case. Yet the talking heads consistently suggested the prosecution was in trouble. A logical assessment should have asked, how could the prosecution's case be collapsing when they had such damning physical evidence? The defense never successfully discredited the core DNA evidence, never explained away the blood trail, and never provided a credible alternative explanation for the mountain of physical connections between Simpson and the crimes. The problem was that television coverage treated each day's proceedings as separate events rather than parts of a comprehensive case. Daily developments were isolated and blown out of proportion, as if each day's testimony constituted an independent trial. This fragmented analysis led to continuous expressions of concern about prosecution viability based on minor setbacks or effective defense cross-examinations. A perfect example was the USA Today headline proclaiming, "Lots of seeds of doubt have been planted," following Johnny Cochran's opening statement. This was before any witness testimony, before any evidence presentation, yet media coverage suggested the case was already in jeopardy unless the prosecution took immediate corrective action. This daily scorekeeping mentality fundamentally misunderstood how criminal trials work. Opening statements don't determine outcomes. Evidence does. Effective cross-examination of individual witnesses doesn't negate the cumulative impact of multiple forms of evidence. But television coverage treated every defense success as potentially case-ending. The quality of legal commentary was particularly problematic. Unlike sports coverage, which features former players and coaches with genuine expertise, like Terry Bradshaw, Joe Montana, and John Madden, the Simpson trial commentary was dominated by attorneys who lacked comparable credentials in high-profile criminal defense. Many of these commentators had never appeared on national television before the Simpson trial, nor had they been prominent in local legal circles. Their sudden visibility on nightly shows represented excellent career opportunities for them, but it became apparent that many lacked the necessary expertise to provide insightful analysis. These talking heads seemed unqualified to understand the complexities of the case accurately, or to provide actionable insights about trial strategy. They reduced sophisticated legal proceedings to speculative chatter rather than informed analysis, yet their opinions carried weight with viewers who assumed television legal experts must know what they were talking about. The commentary format itself was problematic. While evening news summaries provided factual accounts of daily proceedings, the purpose of programs featuring legal commentators engaging in nightly debates was questionable. These weren't educational broadcasts explaining legal concepts. They were entertainment shows where commentators offered speculative interpretations and theoretical analyses. These discussions were presented as serious analytical exercises, but they often amounted to little more than informed guesswork by people watching the same televised proceedings as the general public. The commentators rarely had access to information beyond what viewers could see themselves, yet they presented their opinions as expert analysis. This created a feedback loop where media coverage influenced public perception, which in turn influenced how the case was discussed and analyzed. The constant suggestion that the prosecution was struggling became a self-fulfilling prophecy as viewers, including potential jurors exposed to coverage before sequestration, absorbed the message that this was a weak case. The defense understood and exploited this dynamic brilliantly. They recognized that winning in the court of public opinion could influence the atmosphere surrounding the trial, the confidence of prosecutors, and potentially the jury selection process. Every day that commentators suggested prosecution weakness was a victory for the defense strategy. The prosecution, meanwhile, seemed unprepared for this media dimension of the trial. They appeared to view television coverage as secondary to courtroom performance, not understanding that perception often matters as much as reality in high-profile cases. This media coverage established templates for future high-profile trials, where television commentary could shape public understanding independent of actual evidence. It demonstrated that in the television age, trials are fought not just in courtrooms, but in living rooms across America, where legal experts with questionable qualifications can influence public perception of justice. The Simpson case revealed both the power and the danger of televised justice. While cameras in courtrooms can promote transparency and public education, they can also transform legal proceedings into entertainment spectacles where style matters more than substance, and where commentary can overshadow evidence. The talking heads contributed to a problematic discourse surrounding the trial, possibly impacting public understanding of what was fundamentally a strong prosecution case, undermined by strategic errors rather than weak evidence. They helped create the narrative that Simpson's acquittal was inevitable rather than the product of specific prosecutorial failures that could have been avoided. As we reach the end of our examination of the Simpson trial, we need to understand how all these individual failures combined to create what defense attorney Johnnie Cochran would call the perfect storm, but not the kind he meant. This was a perfect storm of prosecutorial incompetence, defense brilliance, media manipulation, and systemic failures that transformed what should have been a straightforward conviction into the most shocking acquittal in American legal history. Let's trace how each element we've discussed contributed to the final outcome. The prosecution began with overwhelming evidence. Simpson's blood at the crime scene, victim's blood in his car and home, rare gloves connecting both locations, fibers and hair evidence, a suspicious finger injury with an implausible explanation, and a documented history of domestic violence. This evidence should have made conviction inevitable. But evidence alone doesn't convict defendants. The effective presentation of evidence does. And on this crucial front, the prosecution failed catastrophically at every level. Their factual errors undermined credibility. When Marcia Clark misstated basic facts about the victim's injuries, the location of evidence, and witness testimony, she handed the defense opportunities to portray the entire prosecution as unreliable. Every correction the defense could make reinforced their narrative that the case was built on sloppy work. Their strategic decisions were often baffling. The 8-day examination of Dr. Lack suggested serious problems with the autopsy when there weren't any. The failure to call Robert Heidstra as a prosecution witness allowed the defense to use timeline testimony against them. The inability to connect domestic violence clearly to murder risk left jurors wondering why abuse history was relevant. Most devastatingly, their handling of scientific evidence transformed strength into weakness. The DNA evidence should have been the prosecution's knockout punch, statistical proof of guilt in the millions to one range. Instead, through poor presentation and failure to counter defense misconceptions, they allowed rock-solid science to become a source of confusion and doubt. The defense, meanwhile, executed a nearly flawless strategy of misdirection and manipulation. They couldn't make the evidence disappear, so they made it confusing. They couldn't prove Simpson's innocence, so they created alternative explanations and raised questions about everything. Johnnie Cochran understood something the prosecution missed. Trials aren't just about evidence, they're about storytelling. The prosecution told a story about evidence. The defense told a story about racism, police misconduct, and reasonable doubt. In the battle between complex forensic proof and simple emotional narrative, the narrative won. The contamination argument exemplified defense brilliance. They took scientific concepts the jury didn't understand and twisted them into weapons against the prosecution. They convinced 12 people that definitive DNA matches were evidence of contamination rather than evidence of guilt, a complete inversion of scientific reality that should have been impossible to achieve. The Furman strategy was equally brilliant. Instead of disputing the evidence directly, they created a villain who could explain the evidence away. If Furman was racist enough to plant evidence, then all the physical proof became suspect. It didn't matter that evidence planting would have required an impossible conspiracy. The jury now had a non-racial explanation for why an innocent man appeared guilty. The glove demonstration represented the perfect intersection of prosecution, incompetence, and defense opportunism. The prosecution handed Cochran the most powerful visual moment of the entire trial, transforming their strongest physical evidence into a symbol of Simpson's innocence. "If it doesn't fit, you must acquit," became more memorable than DNA statistics or blood evidence. The media coverage amplified every prosecution weakness while normalizing defense arguments. Night after night, talking heads suggested the prosecution was struggling, making every setback seem potentially fatal while treating defense successes as devastating victories. This created an atmosphere where acquittal seemed increasingly inevitable. The jury, bombarded with confusing scientific evidence, conflicting expert testimony, and suggestions of police misconduct, faced an impossible task. They were asked to understand complex DNA analysis, evaluate contradictory forensic opinions, and determine whether racist police officers had conspired to frame an innocent man. Faced with this complexity, they chose the simplest path: reasonable doubt. Not because the evidence was weak, but because the evidence had been made to seem unreliable through skilled manipulation and prosecution failures. Post-trial interviews revealed how successful the defense strategy had been. Jurors echoed defense themes about contamination, evidence planning, and police misconduct. They expressed a doubt about timeline evidence, confusion about scientific proof, and suspicion about police credibility. The defense hadn't just won the case, they had convinced the jury to adopt their interpretation of the evidence. The verdict wasn't just an acquittal, it was a complete validation of the defense strategy and a total repudiation of prosecution performance. In finding Simpson not guilty, the jury was essentially saying they believed the defense narrative about contaminated evidence, planted proof, and racist police over the prosecution's story about overwhelming scientific evidence. This perfect storm couldn't have occurred without every element aligning exactly as it did. Remove any single factor: competent prosecution evidence presentation, effective scientific education, successful Furman rehabilitation, proper media coverage, and the outcome might have been different. But that's exactly what makes this case so instructive. It demonstrates how even overwhelming evidence can be overcome through superior strategy, better storytelling, and more effective jury communication. It shows that in criminal law, having proof of guilt isn't enough. You must be able to present that proof convincingly. The Simpson trial stands as both a monument to defense advocacy and a cautionary tale about prosecution complacency. It proves that no case is so strong that it can't be lost through incompetence, and no evidence is so clear that it can't be confused through skilled manipulation. Most importantly, it reveals that in our justice system, the quality of legal representation often matters more than the strength of evidence. The prosecution had the facts, but the defense had the skills to use those facts against them. In the end, skill triumphed over truth, and advocacy overcame evidence. As we conclude our examination of the Simpson trial, we must grapple with uncomfortable questions about what this case revealed about American justice. Was this a triumph of the adversarial system, protecting an innocent man from racist police? Or was it a devastating example of how skilled lawyers can manipulate evidence to free a guilty defendant? The answer depends partly on your perspective, but the lessons are universal. The first lesson is about the power of narrative in legal proceedings. The prosecution approached this as an evidence case. They believed the facts would speak for themselves and that scientific proof would compel conviction. They were wrong. Facts don't speak. Lawyers speak for facts, and the quality of that advocacy determines how juries interpret evidence. Johnny Cochran understood that trials are fundamentally about storytelling. He crafted a compelling narrative about racist police, framing an innocent black man, while the prosecution offered only a collection of scientific evidence without a unifying story. When narrative conflicts with evidence, narrative often wins because humans are storytelling creatures who need coherent explanations for complex information. The second lesson concerns the critical importance of scientific communication in modern trials. As forensic evidence becomes increasingly sophisticated, the gap between scientific reality and jury understanding grows wider. The prosecution's failure to effectively communicate DNA evidence wasn't just a tactical error. It was a betrayal of scientific truth that allowed pseudoscience to triumph over genuine analysis. This has implications far beyond criminal law. In an era where scientific literacy is crucial for informed democracy, the Simpson trial demonstrated how easily technical concepts can be manipulated by skilled advocates. The contamination argument wasn't just wrong, it was backwards, yet it convinced 12 people because it sounded plausible to non-scientists. The third lesson is about the danger of prosecutorial overconfidence. The prosecution believed their evidence was so strong that competent presentation was unnecessary. They assumed jurors would understand complex scientific concepts without proper education, that obvious guilt would overcome strategic errors, and that evidence quality could compensate for advocacy inadequacy. This overconfidence led to fundamental strategic errors, calling unnecessary witnesses, making factual mistakes, failing to prepare for obvious defense arguments, and conducting high-risk demonstrations without proper testing. In any other context, these would be considered professional malpractice. The fourth lesson concerns the power of character assassination in undermining evidence. The defense couldn't make Simpson's blood disappear from the crime scene, but they could make Detective Furman so toxic that his discovery of evidence became suspicious. By transforming a key witness into a symbol of police racism, they provided a non-racial explanation for evidence that pointed to Simpson's guilt. This strategy works because it exploits legitimate concerns about police misconduct while creating false connections between character flaws and evidence fabrication. The fact that Furman used racial slurs didn't prove he planted evidence, but it made evidence planting seem more believable to jurors predisposed to distrust police. The fifth lesson is about media coverage in high-profile trials. Television commentary didn't just document the trial, it shaped perception of how the trial was progressing. The constant suggestion that the prosecution was struggling became a self-fulfilling prophecy that may have influenced jury selection, public opinion, and even the confidence of the prosecutors themselves. This reveals a fundamental problem with televised justice, the gap between legal reality and media perception. Effective cross-examination or dramatic courtroom moments make good television, but don't necessarily indicate case strength. Media coverage that treats daily developments as victory or defeat misunderstands how cumulative evidence works in criminal trials. The sixth lesson is about the relationship between legal truth and actual truth. The adversarial system is designed to test evidence through vigorous advocacy, with the assumption that truth emerges from this contest. But the Simpson case suggests that superior advocacy can sometimes overcome superior evidence, raising questions about whether our system reliably produces accurate outcomes. This doesn't mean the system is fundamentally flawed. The protection of innocent defendants requires that guilt be proven convincingly, not just established factually. But it does mean that evidence quality and advocacy quality are both necessary for just outcomes. And when there's a significant imbalance, justice can fail. The final lesson is about the ongoing impact of race in American justice. The defense's strategy succeeded, partly because it tapped into legitimate historical grievances about police treatment of African Americans. The narrative of racist police framing innocent black men resonated because it reflected real patterns of injustice that preceded the Simpson case. This context doesn't excuse evidence manipulation or justify acquitting guilty defendants, but it explains why the defense strategy was effective. The prosecution failed to understand that they weren't just trying a murder case. They were addressing centuries of racial tension in American law enforcement. The Simpson trial ultimately stands as both a validation of vigorous defense advocacy and a cautionary tale about prosecutorial competence. It demonstrates that evidence alone isn't sufficient for conviction. Evidence must be presented effectively, defended against attack, and communicated clearly to jurors who lack scientific training. For future prosecutors, the lesson is clear. Respect your opposition, prepare for every argument, communicate scientific concepts clearly, defend your witnesses against character assassination, and never assume that obvious guilt will overcome strategic incompetence. For defense attorneys, the case shows the power of unified strategy, effective narrative construction, and aggressive evidence challenging. It proves that even seemingly hopeless cases can be won through superior advocacy and strategic thinking. For the public, the Simpson trial reveals both the strengths and weaknesses of our justice system. It shows that vigorous advocacy can protect innocent defendants from wrongful conviction, but it also demonstrates that skilled lawyers can sometimes manipulate evidence to confuse rather than clarify truth. Perhaps most importantly, the case reminds us that justice isn't automatic. It requires competent advocacy, informed juries, and institutional safeguards against both prosecutorial overreach and defense manipulation. The Simpson trial failed on several of these fronts, producing an outcome that satisfied neither legal nor moral standards of justice. In the end, the trial of the century taught us that having the right answer isn't enough. You must be able to prove it convincingly. Evidence without advocacy is powerless, just as advocacy without evidence is empty. Justice requires both, and when either is deficient, truth becomes the casualty. The Simpson case will continue to be studied, debated, and analyzed because it represents a perfect storm of legal failure and success, where everything that could go wrong for one side did, while everything that could go right for the other side aligned perfectly. It reminds us that in our imperfect system of human justice, the quality of advocacy often determines the outcome, regardless of the strength of evidence or the clarity of truth. Before we wrap up, if you're drawn to stories that uncover the layers behind landmark trials like this one, check out Scoob. Available on the App Store and Google Play, Scoob dives deep into the biggest celebrity cases and explores the courtroom drama, investigative twists, and cultural impact that shape justice. Download Scoob today and peel back the layers of mystery and truth. Returning to the case that reshaped how we view celebrity justice. The O.J. Simpson trial changed everything. How we view celebrity justice, how we understand the role of race in legal proceedings, how we consume media coverage of trials, and how we think about the relationship between evidence and outcomes in our justice system. From the overwhelming physical evidence that should have guaranteed conviction, to the masterful defense strategy that transformed every prosecution's strength into a weakness, we've seen how the most documented murder case in history became the most shocking acquittal in American law. The blood evidence that led directly to Simpson's door became a source of confusion about contamination. The DNA proof that should have provided scientific certainty became grounds for reasonable doubt. The rare gloves that connected the crime scene to his residence became symbols of his innocence. The prosecution's strongest case became their most devastating defeat. We've examined how prosecutorial incompetence can overcome overwhelming evidence, how skilled defense advocacy can manipulate scientific concepts, and how media coverage can shape perception independent of courtroom reality. Most importantly, we've seen how the quality of legal representation often matters more than the strength of evidence in determining outcomes. The Simpson trial stands as both a monument to vigorous defense advocacy and a cautionary tale about prosecutorial preparation. It proves that no case is so strong that it can't be lost through strategic errors, and no evidence is so clear that it can't be confused through skilled manipulation. Whether you believe justice was served or subverted, the lessons are clear. Evidence must be presented effectively. Scientific concepts must be communicated clearly. Witness credibility must be protected, and prosecutorial competence cannot be taken for granted. The trial of the century ended over 25 years ago, but its impact continues to reverberate through our legal system, our media landscape, and our national conversation about race, celebrity, and justice. It reminds us that in our imperfect system of human justice, the pursuit of truth requires not just evidence, but the wisdom and skill to present that evidence convincingly. Thank you for joining us on this examination of one of the most consequential trials in American history. Remember that justice isn't automatic. It requires eternal vigilance, competent advocacy, and citizens who understand both the power and the limitations of our legal system. Until next time, this is Spotlight Murders with Kieran Caldwell. Keep questioning, keep learning, and never forget that in our democracy, justice is not just the responsibility of lawyers and judges. It's the responsibility of all of us.